This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good afternoon and welcome to Tech 28, Politico Europe's rundown of the best and the brightest that the tech world has to offer. I'm Aoife White, Politico's technology and competition editor. I work with a team of reporters and every day we follow every move that politicians, officials, entrepreneurs, managers, researchers, scientists and campaigners make as they try to guide the digital revolution we are living through. Today, we want to lift the curtain and show you some of the people who move our world. Today, we've come through 2 years of a pandemic and on and off lockdowns. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the coronavirus has finally receded. But now we also have new concerns with the ripples caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine this spring. The war at Europe's doorstep has a huge impact on how we live. Everything from cybersecurity to short-term accommodation, from disinformation online to how well startups can flourish. In the last few months, the European Union has been finalising far-reaching plans to police online content and rein in big tech firms. It has easily become the global leader in tech regulation. The ground is shifting for Europe's tech scene. Leaders are diving into wide-ranging plans to make industry greener and more digital. Taboos on state support and intervention are weakening. Breaking up powerful big tech firms is on the table. Long-standing gridlocks over issues like encryption are being challenged. We wanted to take a closer look at the people in the middle of all these debates with our second annual Tech 28 list. Like last year, we didn't want to chase hot-ticket startup darlings or stiff regulators. It's a simple question with a few simple answers. Who will play the biggest role for good or bad in steering technology policy in the year ahead? How did we come up with the list? Our team of reporters tapped their networks of sources to build a comprehensive picture of what's happening across our beats. We are fortunate in having an excellent team of experienced and knowledgeable reporters who can combine information to form an unbeatable view of the tech scene in Europe. We put our heads together and looked at the big tech problems and possibilities facing us. We then determined who was approaching them in new, interesting and influential ways. This year's ranking is the result of that collaboration. As with last year's list, after choosing our overall number one, we split the remaining 27 into 3 groups of 9 rulemakers, rule breakers and visionaries and scored them according to their power, vision and reach. In this way, big and bold ideas can trump hard power and compelling voices that spread around Europe and beyond can be recognised. Let's take a look at who made our list. Some wield power in the corridors of European Union institutions in Brussels. As chair of the European Parliament's Internal Market Committee, Germany's Green politician Anna Cavazzini has guided 2 landmark pieces of legislation, the DSA, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. Now she has her eyes set on strengthening a new law that would force tech app giants like Apple to use a common charger to reduce waste. If she gets her way, it'll be a law that plays well with European voters but goes directly against the interests of global tech giants. Others push their views on Europe's technology policy from national capitals. Francesca Bria wants to turn Italy into a star of investment-driven innovation through the Italian National Innovation Fund, while in the United Kingdom, filmmaker Bibon Kidron advocates for children's digital rights. The Restart Project's Ugo Valauri asks why you'd buy a new iPhone when you should be able to repair the old one. And we're waiting with bated breath to find out what exactly former Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz will do after his soft landing at Thiel capital. Volker Wissing in Berlin and Alexandra van Huffelen in The Hague are putting tech high on the agenda in their countries. Some have a high-profile role in showing how tech policy should be done, such as Wojciech Wiewiorowski, the European Data Protection Supervisor. But being a tech influencer goes far beyond national parliaments. The people who change the game are everywhere. They're not only grey-haired men in suits, many are young, many are female. Some do the detailed work in administrations that really decide how policies are enforced. We wanted to shine a light on Filomena Chirico, an advisor to Thierry Breton. on Leah Zuber, the team leader of DG Competition, the UK's Joe Jones, Ivo Volman, the data director at the European Commission's DG Connect, Fabio Panetta of the European Central Bank. Some are leading companies like Delphine Ernotte of France Télévisions, Eric Demuth of Bitpanda, Peter Vennick of ACMO. Some are embedded in businesses like Oliver Bethel, Director of Competition at Google, who's guiding the search giant as it faces antitrust scrutiny, and Emmanuel Merrill of Airbnb. Others are outside those traditional power centres but have an outsized influence on them, like Ian Brown, an information security researcher, Ben Scott at Reset, Zakaria Bufangacha of the FNV trade union, Fanny Hidvegi of Access Now, Kieran Martin, previously at the NCSC, Aurélie Collier of the European Tech Alliance. Those are most of the people on our list, but not all. We also asked our readers who they thought should be there, and we got tons of responses and comments about the names you wanted to see in lights. The top pick was a tie. They rowed on Twitter, made up on Twitter. One of them might even buy Twitter. You voted for Thierry Breton, the EU's internal market commissioner, and a huge personality who's put tech and industry strategy on the map during this mandate. You also voted for his recent sparring partner, Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, and a billionaire who's done his best to make the dry topic of mergers and acquisitions a fun show in recent weeks, with his announcement that he would buy Twitter. In third place came a lady we never stop talking about, Margrethe Vestager, the EU's Executive Vice President for a Digital Age. And we have honourable mentions too to the Spanish Digital and AI Minister, Carmen Artigas, and the MEPs who guided the DMA and the DSA over the past year, Andrea Schwab and Christel Schaldemose. But now, let's get on with our final countdown. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a visionary in the House for Tech 28 2022. Moving fast and breaking things doesn't have to be a Silicon Valley motto. Europe also has entrepreneurs who've managed to disrupt the old world and drag us kicking and screaming into the digital future. Some of them even started out in Uppsala, Sweden's flipping burgers and Burger King. Our top visionary this year is Sebastian Schmidtkowski, the co-founder and CEO of Klarna, a fintech company that's riding an e-commerce wave to secure a multi-billion valuation rivaling that of European banks. Klarna has already learned to roll with the punches. Although it launched in 2005, its real success has come in the past 6 years with rocketing growth during the pandemic when we all sat at home and did our shopping online. Klarna's magic can be explained in 4 letters: BNPL. Buy now, pay later. People shopping online can use Klarna to split the payment into 4 installments or delay payment by a month. Now, EU policymakers are concerned that while products like Klarna are interest-free, it's still a form of credit and should be regulated as such. The challenges for Klarna in the year ahead are to keep up its rapid growth and steer a clear route through a regulatory maze. Politico's technology reporter, Peter Haag, has been following Klarna closely as it negotiates in Brussels. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Eva. And it's my pleasure to welcome here live in Brussels in our studio the man who co-founded Klarna. It's Sebastian Schmidtkowski. We're really glad that you could make it all the way from Sweden. Welcome in Brussels. Before we dive into it, I want to say to the audience first that we want to make this as interactive as possible, and you can ask questions using the Slido app and with the hashtag PoliticoTech28. Welcome, Sebastian. Can I say Sebastian?
Yes, of course.
Great.
Thank you. I feel very humbled to be on this list as well, so thank you so much.
Thanks. As Eva laid out before, we've seen during the pandemic, of course, that shopping online, it proved to be very convenient. And of course, shopping online, paying online, it became very big. People got used to this idea of buy now, pay later. But of course, that's out there. We're now here in Brussels. When you're meeting here with policymakers, you met with a commissioner earlier today. Do they really get this idea of buy now, pay later? Can you make your pitch to them?
Yeah, well, I think most importantly, I'm trying to explain them that that's just one feature of what we do, right? So the way I think about Klarna today is really a third-party network, right? So in the payment space, you have 4-party networks like Visa and MasterCard, who are very slow at innovating because they need to get both your bank who's giving you your card, as well as the bank who works with the merchants to adopt all changes, and it's just very slow, right? So you have these third-party networks like Klarna, like American Express and PayPal, who have a direct relationship with the consumer, and then work with Adyen and Stripe and others to have a relationship with merchants. And so the benefit of that is we can innovate much faster. As we bring new innovation to the space, we can roll it out to 150 million users as we have now, whereof the majority of them, over 100 million, are in Europe. so we can innovate much faster, right? And then part of what we offer is credit, but you got to remember, like on our network, 40% of our volume transactions is debit. So credit is only 60%. And then when we come to the actual credit part, I think there is some, and this part obviously of the discussion with politicians is that we try to explain that the credit that we offer is not really about lending. The majority of it, there's some that is about lending, but a large majority of it is when you shop online with a debit card, you simply don't have the protection. What if I don't get that product? What if it doesn't look like I want it to? What if I want to make a return? I have to wait for my money back on my debit card. So there's a lot of friction points associated with buying online. Mm-hmm. And credit in that form is actually a solution to that problem, right? And that's actually a very traditional solution because mail order company has been offering this for decades, right? So it's not really new. And I think in an online, and then we could probably have done a better job of explaining to people that like it's always better to first and foremost pay with money you have, use debit. But in some environments, credit makes sense. And then it's more a question of what form of credit is good and bad, right?
Critics have said that buy now, pay later, it's a form of credit, of course, but it's maybe a form of credit that doesn't present itself as credit. You might trick vulnerable people into putting themselves further into debt. What's your answer to that?
That is very far from the truth. And but look, we have very strict rules for credit on our network, which actually the big credit card networks do not apply. We don't do revolving. We have a capped interest rate. We underwrite transaction by transaction. We never borrow people cash. There's tons of things that we do that the big or traditional banks on credit cards do not do that makes this product actually, you can see it in the KPIs because our losses are about 20 to 30% below credit card industry standards. So not only is it working, it is actually providing better protection to consumers than that. But with that said, than the kind of traditional forms of credit that you've had before. Now, with that said, however, obviously, we're not anarchists. So we believe in regulation. Regulation is good for society. And so we do think that some of the services that we provide may benefit from having slightly more regulation. But it's very, very sensitive because you have to remember that if you put too much regulation in, you get less competition. And the strongest force of growing societal value and consumer is still competition. So there's a balance always between these two.
But isn't that a bit too much like the narrative of US big tech players? They also said, like, we want regulation. But when Brussels came up with regulation, they said, yeah, but not this kind of regulation. Is that the same?
Well, maybe to some degree, because some regulation is really poor. I think maybe one of the worst regulations that's come out of Brussels is the cookies. I once calculated that if you take every European citizen spending a few seconds every day on accepting cookies, it adds up to 147 lifetimes per day wasted. And the problem with it, it's not supporting privacy. It's made us complacent. We don't read the terms of use anymore, right? So what we believe in strongly and would like to see is more less prescriptive regulation like that and more outcome-based. And that's the benefit of being a bank. We are a bank, we're fully regulated. We have some great outcome-based regulation like capital adequacy ratios, equity to balance, KPI-led, right? So if you think about, like, for example, that KPI that I said, in the end, if you're worried about people overusing credit on our network, give us a KPI. Tell us losses cannot be higher than on credit cards or other products. And let the market innovate around how to hit that. Like, I have 7,000 people in Klarna. I cannot micromanage everyone. It's impossible. I have to give people KPIs to hit. And so why do politicians sometimes believe that micromanagement is an efficient form of regulation? I don't think so. I think KPIs is better. Yeah. KPIs also needs to be described and written. But outcome-based regulation has tons of benefits, right? So but then again, I also think that that's not entirely true because I think that the tech companies of the US, they don't always have the customer's best interest at heart. So
you said, like, we need to go to outcome-based regulation. Let's go to the regulation that's currently on the table here in Brussels. It's the new consumer credit rules. As it's currently proposed, that would give you some more things that you would have to do. You would have to provide consumers with more information before they make a payment. You would also have to do a bit more affordability checks. If you're looking at this regulation, is this poor regulation, or are you willing to go ahead with this?
No, some of it is poor. I mean, I'll give a very concrete example. In Finland, the regulator thought that it was a good idea to say that after 11 p.m. in the evening, you're not allowed to apply for credit. there's data, we have data that suggests that as well, that people that do borrow in the middle of the night do tend to have a slightly higher risk than people borrowing in the middle of the day. But when you write prescriptive regulation like that, what happens? Everyone who works night shifts suddenly doesn't have access to the same services as people working day shifts. So again, when you think about, like, it does sound so reasonable, ask more questions, ask people for more questions in order to get credit. Okay, but what if people don't answer these questions truthfully? What if people what if that also creates more friction for people to use this service than use the traditional bank that they've used before? What does that do for the competitive environment? So those suggestions aren't great. Come to us and say, your losses have to be lower than the traditional products. And let us prove that you can do that without adding more friction for customers to shift. When I was in Sweden as a kid, I used to pay €1 per minute making a phone call. Then, on my mobile phone, then this politician came up with a great idea that I could take my phone number with me from one carrier to another. You created mobility. And suddenly, I'm paying nothing for making a phone call, right? So, like, the point is that if you do, like, it may sound reasonable, but it's not always connected to reality. And so I think that, like, some of these regulatory exceptions, like, do rather ask for outcome-based regulations. So I think there are fallacies with those.
Yeah.
And
you mentioned before the cookies. Nobody reads the cookie walls.
Yeah.
One of the provisions in the consumer credit rules that are now proposed in Brussels is information for consumers. And there was a campaign online by Klarna lobbyists saying, like, people won't read this. Is that not too easy to say that?
No, of course it is easy to say that, but I think, again, it comes back to, like, what's the outcomes that we're looking for, right? So if I think, like, instead, I would regulate and say, do a survey. Like, one thing that we have sometimes been criticized is people did not understand it was credit. Okay, so enforce on us that we have to do a survey and ask all our consumers whether they understood what's credit or not. And if the KPI shows that we're not hitting something, whatever, 99% understood or something, then we have to do that. Like, but don't tell us exactly how to do it, because you see what I mean? Like, because again,
what's the current number of people?
In my opinion, I am very surprised. This is one of the things that I don't really understand where it comes from, because, to be honest, I've never met a consumer myself, and I speak to a lot of my customers that has told me, I bought something online and I thought I would never have to pay. Like everyone says, like, obviously I understood that I have to pay at some point of time, right? So that specific argument I find very confusing to hear. But that doesn't mean, look, again, I mean, this, to me, the original intent of GDPR was so amazing, because the problem why we are stuck with tech giants from a different country in this market is because our data is locked in their systems. If regulators in the EU recognize that and start saying, I should, with the click of a button, be able to take all of my data from, let's say, WhatsApp and move it into Signal or Telegram, everything, my history, my messages, everything, then if I'm unhappy with WhatsApp, I will just move. Yeah. And if I'm unhappy with what WhatsApp is doing with my data, I will just move. Yeah. So, like, it's also protection for privacy to be able to do that, right? But the problem is, so I think actually the data mobility is the key that's going to force companies like myself and others to compete by providing the best value for customer based on the data that they have decided to share with me, as opposed to trying to lock me in different structures.
That brings us already to a question from the audience, because you're speaking, of course, also about interoperability, like moving data from one service to another. So you should be very happy with the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Service Act, the two
from
bills.
That perspective, yes.
That's a good thing?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. And I think, again, the irony you were saying about that, previously, the tech companies, like, I think the irony, we were very deeply involved in open banking. We acquired Sofort in Germany, that was kind of the beginning of open banking, who offered a digital assistant allowing you to, do things on your behalf with your bank. And as we were talking to politicians about the importance of open banking and how it could liberate consumers from the banks, we, however, realized at the same point of time that Klarna was growing. And I remember having this fun taxi ride in Bratislava, going to see some politicians, where we were sitting there and was like, is this legislation still good for us? Because we used to be small, and now we're big. And who's actually going to suffer from this legislation? It's us nowadays, because now we have 100 million users. Yeah. And so obviously you can then... And then I realized how the bank were thinking. They were thinking, we could have stopped the taxi and gone back. But if you genuinely are long-term in your business, then you realize that competition is going to make you better. Yeah. It's going to make you better, right? So, like, it's a question, if I have to focus on my quarterly report, I may want to not promote data mobility. But if I'm long-term, it directly makes sense. So to be honest, some of this legislation provided now in the credit that you suggested, just to tie back to that, it's not us it's going to affect. I mean, it's going to affect the small competitors trying to compete with us, where their customers will have more friction.
Yeah, you're also, of course, competing with for example, the big credit card companies. Earlier, when it was interesting when we were seeing a picture of Margrethe Vestager, you said like, "I love her," or you're a fan of her.
I'm a very big fan of her. Yes.
Why?
No, because I do think that she is really going after the right thing, which is, I believe, in general, if you look at take my industry as an example, there's $16 trillion of retail payments. Currently, that generates revenue to the banking industry and payments industry of $440 billion. Now, half of that is the US and half of that is the EU, fine. But the half that is in the EU, is that reasonable? That our industry charges society? Are we creating value for $220 billion? I would say no, we're just shifting money between accounts. It's not that difficult, to be entirely honest, right? And so this industry has to shrink. It has to become smaller. That money has to return to society. And the only way that happens is through competition. And what Vestager does is exactly promoting and pushing that competition to make sure. And I think I appreciate the fact that she's been so forceful against people who try to lock customers in and try to,
But of course, you also have to make money. You will also, in some way, lock your customers in because you're making money by asking fees to merchants who use the tool. If there is a competitor coming who asks a lower fee to merchants, well, then you're losing, right?
No, not entirely, because again, what I'm telling my investors is, this payments industry will shrink. It will become, the whole banking industry will shrink. It's unsustainable. It's cost society too much money. But what I'm telling them is we're going to have a bigger slice of a smaller pie. So the point is that we can still grow. There's tons of room for growing. And in essence, when I'm not locking the customer in, I'm doing the opposite. I'm saying I want to make sure that when the customer uses my service, they always look at it and say, I want to use this service because they provide me the best value for my money, right? Now, so I actually think that you can stay competitive by just being very focused at that. But it's more demanding because rather than just finding some nice ways to lock your customers up, you actually need to stay focused every day at providing customer value, right?
If you say we have to stay focused, what's like the grand vision for Klarna in like 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think, look, it comes back to exactly what I said, which is that, we a few years ago had this we were thinking about, well, what's the future of financial services? And I believe generally it looks something like this. You wake up in the morning, a few years from now, and your computer/digital assistant says, I've analyzed your mortgages, and I realized I could save you $5 by switching provider, and the only thing you need to do is say yes. At that point in time, do you care which bank you have? You don't. So what you realize is that's a world where return on assets, return on equity looks very different than it does for the banking industry today. It's a super competitive environment. And you have to ask yourself, what do I as a company want to be? I can try, to your point, lean backwards from that and say, I'm just going to try to protect my margins as long as I can. But if you're really long term, you realize the only place to be as a company in the financial industries is I can at least aspire for being that digital assistant of yours. Because maybe if I saved you $10, you'll tip me $1 for doing it, right? So I think that that is the only aspiration that you can have, that you can help people save time, save money, make them less worried about their finances, so that you really provide that value, which is the original purpose of banking. The original purpose of banking was not to rip as much interest rate to yourself as possible, but was actually to provide some kind of value to your customers, right? So.
How difficult is that to keep that focus and while also, of course, keeping tab of all the new developments? For example, we have cryptocurrencies. I mean, the ECB is also looking at this new digital euro. What's your place in all that?
Well, it is difficult, I would say, because I think it requires you to wake up every morning and actually, and to something that you mentioned, Burger King. When I came here, and it's kind of funny because it made me actually remember something, which is that when I went to work to Burger King, I could not go there and just stand around. I had to work all the time. I had to serve my customers. I had to, man this. And so, that's what it's required. It's required you going to work every day and thinking, what can I do for my customer today, right? But so it's difficult. It's very demanding, and I'm very proud of our 7,000 people that work at Klarna across Europe and primarily Europe and US and so forth, who are doing that every day and going there. But again, we make mistakes as well. We've done tons of mistakes. We used to offer revolving. We did credit products that weren't healthy for consumers. We charged too high fees. We have done tons of them. We tried to lock customers up in our systems. We did a lot of these things. So I'm not saying that like we are like the angels or whatever, but it's just that we've learned over the years. And again, we benefit from that long-term perspective, right? So I think when it comes to navigating all these things, what I try to do, I try to talk to a lot of startups. So I spend a lot of time myself. I'm not that interested, like sometimes people go, oh my God, the CEO of this large bank wants to have a meeting with you. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm quite busy actually. But then somebody comes and say like, the CEO of this exciting startup wants to see with you. And I'm like, yay! That's exactly it. I want to keep at the digital frontier. You see what I need to see currently all the time what's happening at the frontier, right? And that's what's critical.
If we're speaking about long-term perspective, one of the things in the long term, regrettably, is also, of course, climate change and sustainability. You're also, of course, empowering that e-commerce business with vehicles bringing packages to your doorsteps. Yeah. Is that still sustainable? And is it justified that you're powering that business?
Well, look, I think sometimes we ask that question. I think. As much as, with two things. For the first, I think that like you may also say that the person who's built the road to the shopping mall is somehow contributing to you going to the shopping mall, and you're spending money there, and as a consequence, it's their responsibility that you contribute. Like at some point in time, like you have to ask yourself, like where does the responsibility of a company start and end? And with that said, I think we contribute to making retail and commerce more efficient. With that said, however, we obviously want to explore whether we can contribute to this very, very severe crisis that we're facing from a climate perspective. And one of the things that we recognize is that we're the only payments network in the world that on every transaction, we do not only have the amount, but we know the exact items that you purchase. We have the full digital receipt. So one of the things we launched is the first worldwide carbon footprint. Because of that data superiority compared to Visa, MasterCard, and others, we can actually calculate some kind of carbon footprint impact of your spending. And as much as I don't believe too much in chastising, like chasing people, but I believe there's value in helping people take good decisions. There's a reason why when we open food today, it says something about how much sugar in there, right? Why is there no information about how much carbon footprint there is? Like, why isn't politicians standardizing that? And as they're not, and that's going too slow, maybe Klarna can do that for you. So maybe we can at least let you know what the consequences of your decision is. And then people have different lives, different prerequisites. Maybe this purchase makes sense for that individual. But I think promoting commerce in itself is not bad. But obviously, if we can, in addition to that, promote commerce that is more sustainable.
Do you mean that like a company should also be a bit parenting or educating the customer on that kind of elements?
Parenting may be a strong word, but I think there's a balance. But I also think that one thing which also changes is like when we started Klarna, we were just three, in that case, guys who were 23 years old, who were out of school, and we just started a business. And our first focus was, how are we going to pay our salaries, right? Like that was the first focus. And I think that's true. If you start a restaurant today, maybe you're just thinking about like whatever. But if the restaurant becomes McDonald's, or if Klarna's become what it is, I do think we have a different responsibility to society than when you're just running that thing. So this is obviously something that's matured with us as well, that we recognize today, wow, hundreds of millions of users and so forth. So we try to figure out what connects naturally to our business. I just don't want to be one of the greenwashers who just pay off to carbon, offset, like whatever. We do that as well because it's important as a basics. But the point is like, that's not enough. We wanted to try to understand, can we do something more? But that is also tied to our business. That's kind of, fits to what we do. And I do think that's important.
Yeah, you said we started with 3 guys. Now you're with 7,000, people in your company. I read your Twitter bio and it said like, I'm trying my best to be the nightmare of banks. Yeah. We also had a question about the whole idea of decentralization, blockchain. Is there already a new trend that maybe is going to be the nightmare of your company?
Yeah. Well, look, when it comes to Bitcoin and blockchain and so forth, I personally, I think about that in 2 ways, right? So to me, we have this technology. And we have an asset. Bitcoin is an asset. People put money in different assets. I am a little bit surprised that regulators and police in Europe are not more concerned that the securities laws that we have that doesn't allow you to promote securities totally uncontrolled don't seem to be policed or applied to Bitcoin. Like, to me, that is just crazy. Like, I can go to Twitter and read, get rich, buy Bitcoin, but if I would say, get rich, buy Klarna stock, then I would go to jail. Like, that just doesn't make sense to me. But it's an asset. That's one part. It's an asset. okay, I'm fine. People can put money in their assets. Like some people want to buy stock, some people want to buy a painting, somebody.
But it's an asset that Europe should crack down on.
No, I don't say that. I think the same rules should apply for it for our other assets. When you invest in specific assets like stock, there are specific rules that apply for buying those assets, and I'm very surprised that suddenly some assets can get around that. That doesn't make some sense to me. But with that said, then you have the technology itself of using, and unfortunately, we at Klarna have tried to apply that technology multiple times to solve a real problem for our customers and have been not capable of doing so. We haven't found a problem that a blockchain made more efficient or whatever. So we are obviously still open and still exploring to learn such things, but so far we haven't done that.
But you're quite skeptical of all the blockchain technology.
Well, I just haven't seen, like, the point is that somebody's sending money between two places and like, look how fast it went. And I'm like, yeah, PayPal did that 20 years ago. The problem is not sending between two accounts. The problem is getting that money out in that market and doing that in a compliant way with Know Your Customer and AML and all that regulation, right? So like, and then everyone looks at that, fantastic, it went so fast. Like, yeah, but that's not a real problem. The real problem is a very poor regulation we have around Know Your Customer AML that is extremely inefficient, that is there to try to target terrorists. And it's one of the worst regulations that come out of this city, because like I'll give you a fun example that I use often. It's just like, as a bank, we're supposed to check this list of potential terrorists, and every time a potential terrorist applies for an account with Klarna or uses our services, we're supposed to report. I'm one of few people who've opened that list. One of the names on that list is Mohammed, based outside of Paris. That's racist, first and foremost, and secondly, I mean, honestly, how many reports am I going to send? So you're putting all financial institutions in this total deadlock where they can choose either to overwhelm the financial police with reports for things that are not relevant, or be non-compliant, be incompliant or not be compliant, right? It's very poor regulation, and the only thing you need to do to get around it as a terrorist is get a fake ID. That's how simple you need to do, if you like. So like, there are unfortunately, those are kind of examples of very poor regulations that, you know.
So you're not a fan of cookies and also not a fan of the...
No, because it doesn't, and I think, I sometimes feel, I actually feel sad for a lot of big banks that have been fined huge amounts of money for not being compliant with AML Know Your Customer when the law is totally impossible to follow, practically speaking. But nobody dares to say that because they believe that when saying that, they're saying their bank is incompliant, right?
We've been speaking a lot about regulation, and you've shown that you're not a fan of many of them. But let's shift to.
But I am. Sorry, I just really want to.
Okay.
I am not an anarchist, right?
Okay.
That's why I also I'm not a big fan of the crypto, because I do think there's a lot of anarchistic movement in there. I believe regulations is good. I want regulations, but I want good regulation. That's the only point. I think it's good for society. Like if you and I would interact here, if there were no rules, we could just hit each other. I don't think that's a good society. Like without consequences.
Let's not do a Will Smith and let's not hit each other. Let's shift from regulation to support, because Klarna started in 2005. Now it's a big company. Of course, we don't have that much successful EU tech companies. Now you're in Brussels. Do you have a word of advice for policymakers how they should support startups to make it big?
Well, to be honest, I think it's just a matter of time. So if you look at US right now, and especially Silicon Valley, it is so overheated from many aspects, property prices, everything. Every startup I meet today in Silicon Valley, and I speak to quite a lot of them, when I ask when their engineers are, they're in Ukraine. So like, it's only the founder that sits in Silicon Valley still. So to me, tons of amazing engineering talent and people are in Europe. And it's just a matter of time. You already have companies like Spotify, like Bolt, like Klarna, like, you know, there's tons of already. They're just not, the difference between the real difference, I would say, why we still believe there's a tech dominance by the US is media. If I get an article about Klarna in TechCrunch, then Swedish journalists write about it. You see what I mean? So like, a lot of our attention is still on the tech sector there.
Yeah.
But I would say,
you have to admit the attention of politicians for European startups is also not that big.
No.
Yeah. So what should they do? What is their?
Well, I hope we will get. You know, I hope that people will see that. You know, I hope that there will be a higher amount of interest, that people will promote and see the companies that exist. And obviously, our challenge a little bit in Europe is that we have different languages. we look very much still very domestic, even if we're a union. And so if one company is, Spotify and Klarna successful in Sweden, a French person doesn't necessarily know about that. The French person will know the Swedish, the French tech and so forth. So I think a lot of it is just promotion. It's media who can, do more lists like this and others to promote these things. I think it's a mix for us, but I'm not worried. I think, the tech companies that I meet in Europe are so high quality. There's such an amazing drive, talent, and so forth. My prediction is that in 10 years, we will have as many $1 trillion market cap tech companies in Europe as in the US.
That's a bold prediction. I saw a question that is a bit related to that. If you could be an EU commissioner for digital for a week, let's maybe start with a day. Now you're in Brussels. Which to-dos would be on top of your list? And let's leave out the regulation. Let's go for support. What would you do to support digital in Europe?
Well, I think, again, I'm sorry, but that would be, again, what I talked about digital mobility. So my one line would be, every service online has to offer an export data button that is clearly visible, simple to do, and a standard for how that data, and it has to encompass all the data. That will allow customers to move the data around, and that will promote competition. Yeah. And it will allow European companies to really compete with better services versus the US tech companies that today have locked up a lot of our data. Yeah. I think it's as simple as that, in my opinion. It may sound naive, but that's my belief.
So a big export data button.
Yes, that's it. An export data button. It's as simple as that.
Klarna is, as said, a big company now, but it's still a private company. What is the time horizon for bringing it public?
It's funny like that. I mean, I don't pride myself in being. I mean, I think predicting markets is writing horoscopes or something. So it's just as predictive as that. But I am at least happy about the fact that during autumn last year, I was asked that question, and I said, look, I think this is a too volatile market, and it's not the timing, and at least this time around I seem to have been right about that. So, but I was lucky, obviously. I wouldn't take credit for it. I want to, when we IPO, I hope to do so in a stable market that has a little bit predictability. Now it's been volatile on the other end and very so far. Yeah. So we'll see. Maybe a few years or something. We'll see.
Okay, cool. If you're flying back to Sweden, because you have to do that already quite quickly after this conversation, and you're back in Sweden tonight, what's the one thing that you will keep in mind about Brussels?
What I will keep in mind in Brussels, what I was very excited about today was when I was here a few years ago, there was a different generation of politicians that did not understand digital services, that did not have this at heart, that barely had used digital services themselves. And I was spending so much time here during 13, 15 and so forth to just try to even explain what this was. And I've met fantastic, talented politicians today. And people around in this city who genuinely understand technology, who understand the power, who see the benefits of it. And I think that's going to make such a big difference for the legislation that we're going to see going forward. So that was I'm just much more excited than before I came here, because I have been slightly worried, to be honest, compared to, for example, UK, that I think is also now advancing their legislative agenda.
They will like to hear. So we have to wrap up this conversation. I think it was a really interesting chat. I hope you liked it as well.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
And I'll hand it over back to Eva, who will present us with a lot more names going further. Thanks.
We're speaking to you from Brussels, a town full of rule makers. Making our top choice was a tough decision, but our eyes were drawn to artificial intelligence, where we found two rule makers who we think matter in the year ahead. Two lawmakers, Brando Benifei and Dragos Tudorache, have been at the centre of negotiations that could end up banning facial recognition and government-led social scoring. They are our two top rule makers for 2022. Benifei is an idealist Italian S&D politician, and Tudorache a pragmatic Romanian liberal and Romania's former interior minister. They've worked together closely on the Artificial Intelligence Act, agreeing several red lines for how AI should be used, including a ban on controversial algorithms. They've a tough road ahead of them as they face intense lobbying from businesses, heavy debate at the Parliament, and calls from campaigners to crack down on harmful AI. They are hoping to finalise the Parliament's position on the AI Act before the end of the year, which could see them hammer out a final law in 2023. Our rule breaker is living through extraordinary and heartbreaking times. Mikhailo Fedorov is Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation. Within days of the Russian invasion, the 31-year-old used social media to call on the CEOs of some of the world's leading tech companies to urge them to cut ties with Moscow. He asked Tim Cook to stop selling Apple products in Russia. He urged Elon Musk to free up satellites to give Ukrainians internet access. He called on Reed Hastings to cut Netflix off from Russia. This was only the start of his work. His team has recruited thousands of Ukrainian and foreign cyber experts to both combat Russian attacks and to target Kremlin vulnerabilities so that Kyiv can go on the offensive. In times of peace, he's been an advocate for Ukraine as a digital destination. In times of war and exile, he's doing the same to draw attention to skilled Ukrainians at home or abroad who can contribute to the country's future. As a creative thinker, he's using his skills to call out Western companies and countries to force further sanctions and restrictions on Russia's use of digital services. We count ourselves very lucky to have him here in the studio with us today. We'll turn now to Politico Europe's own cybersecurity editor, Lauren Serulus, who has a few questions on what the Minister has in store.
Thank you, Eva. It is my pleasure to welcome Ukraine's Vice Prime Minister and Minister for Digital Transformation, Mikhailo Fedorov. Minister, welcome to Brussels. Welcome to our studio. Very glad to have you with us. For our audience online, the Minister will speak in Ukrainian. You can watch in English, and if you're watching us online, the default view will be in English. For our Ukrainian viewers joining in to watch the interview, you can switch off the translation on the Politico website and listen to the conversation with the Minister speaking in Ukrainian. One last call to send in your questions to the Minister. You can use Slido, our app for that, on our website. You can see it there, and using Slido, using the hashtag PoliticoTech28 reference. Without further ado, I'd like to turn to you, Minister. Thank you for being with us. If you don't mind, I would like to start with a question on your agenda here in Brussels today. Because you've come to Brussels, this is the first time that you are in Brussels since the war started end of February. And since that war started, you many times over have asked European leaders for support for the digital sector and for the use of technology and the way that technology is being instrumentalized in the war. So why come now, and what do you want to get out of this trip?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to see you, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. To tell you the truth, it's the second day of our visit. Yesterday we were in Warsaw, in Poland, and we opened the DIA business. This is to support entrepreneurs, for Ukrainian citizens, for them to start their own business when they are abroad, while they are not in Ukraine, and so that they support the economy of Ukraine and the distance. We are also having the same project, approximately 20 centers all over Ukraine. So in Brussels, we have a very powerful agenda. We are meeting commissars from the European Commission. We are meeting tech companies. We are talking about the success in cyberspace, about digital space. We're discussing our plans for the nearest future. And today we have shown that our digital system is quite resilient. We continue to launch new services, and we need additional help today in order to scale up those projects that we launch in Ukraine. And we hope that already in June we will be able to join Digital Europe program and to continue and to join digitally the big European family and to do joint projects, because we do have something to share with Europe.
Have you gotten concrete commitments from your counterparts, for instance, Commission Vice President Margrethe Vestager, who you met earlier today, about that support through programs like the Digital Europe program and how Ukraine will be able to benefit from that in the future?
We will try to join already in June, July this year. These are our hopes and this is our aspirations, and we will do our best to join the programs, but it depends on the European Commission. We will hope that it will take place. It will be unprecedented because we are not yet members of European Union, but I'm sure that this will happen.
I visited Kiev in 2019 when the tech sector was already sort of emerging as a strong sort of pillar of the Ukrainian economy. That was before the election that brought your president to power, President Zelensky, and which brought you into the government. I was curious because we've seen the figures in the past years of that sector and how it performed. And it really has emerged as sort of the Ukrainian strong point, as the fastest growing part of the economy. I was curious if you had a sense of the damage that the tech sector and the digital economy has suffered from the war so far. Do you have an estimation of what that looks like?
Of course, the war has hit on all the spheres of business. But what we managed to build within the last 2 years, within the digital ministry and the brand which we managed to build, IT brand of Ukraine, that led to the fact that in the first quarter of this year, the income of our sector did not decrease, even increased. So that happens automatically. This is the tendency which we follow on from the spillover from the previous year. So the results could have been even better if not for the war. But during this time, we try to do our best to transform transform Ukraine into outsourcing country that is producing something for other countries, for the country which produces for itself. We want to encourage our startups and for them to attract more income. So we have started a very good taxing system before the war. The tax system for our technological companies, DSCT, we have 5 times decreased the taxation for these companies. So we also have launched a fund, venture fund, to help these companies. 2 years ago, we started a fund for startups, and it became one of the biggest investors in Ukraine. So we have conducted certain liberalization, deregulation for these sectors. And we have a special KPI to increase the part to 10% of IT. So it was 4% before our ministry was created. We see that this sector grows. It's of course organic because the world is growing and the future is for tech companies. And also because we have incentives in our country. We invest in the education, we transform our education. We have a clear-cut vision what we have to do to make Ukraine into the country of producer country, so that the IT is taking a bigger share in the economy of our country.
What's interesting to see as well is how that tech sector sort of sprung into action the moment that the war started. And the community that you sort of oversee as minister and the whole IT sector, its engineers, they all in some way or another play a role, I think, in the wartime situation. Can you give me a bit of a sense of what the feeling is like in the tech sector and how the tech sector sort of sees itself as an actor in the war in Ukraine?
Well, of course, there is a big responsibility in the IT sector because they are forming, they are responsible for income in different currencies to Ukrainian budget through taxing, taxation, and we have done our best to maintain this sector, and we relocate many companies. So some companies have redeployed deployed when the war started into the different regions of Ukraine. We are trying to give, using Starlink technologies to provide internet, very stable internet. We are also helping our clients for them to support the ongoing projects. We are helping to cross the border to IT specialists if they have to attend some business meeting in Europe, for example, because, you know, the borders in Ukraine are closed at the moment because we are living through mobilization. But we are trying to help our IT sector to overcome these barriers. So there are no supervision, there are no checkups of business. We want to decrease the taxation in a more radical way. The government is trying to maintain stability of this sector as much as possible. And our IT companies are heroes at the moment because in our cities we have air missile attacks, there are shelling, there are constant sirens. You can't imagine that yourself, how to work in such conditions. And our companies continue to do everything they are doing every day in this, in the basements, in the bomb shelters. They are continuing their responsibilities and they fulfill all their orders and they increase the income to the budget even more than before. They are heroes as much as our armed forces who are defending us at the front. They defend Ukraine and also the rest of Europe from the Russian aggressor. And that also happens in economy. We continue to be on the front line. This is our Ukrainian spirit to fight for our country, to develop our country, and we manage.
And one of the most eye-catching, or at least the aspects of this that has gotten most attention is the element of the IT army of Ukraine, I believe, which is an initiative you publicly supported. You actively called for support from everything from sort of activists, IT engineers, to sort of more hackers and others. My question is, it's a bit, that initiative, the IT Army of Ukraine, is sometimes described as sort of a volunteer army that works on its own and is sort of its own sort of ecosystem and group. But on the other hand, there is a clear call from the government and there is communication with the government over those initiatives. So my question is this an operational part of the government response in the war, or is this literally sort of a volunteer IT army that works by itself?
2.5 years ago, we have created the Ministry of Digital Transformation, and during these 2.5 years, we have developed the ecosystem product DIA. This is a one-stop shop where all the state services online. We have started the first e-passports, and they are the same validity as the normal passports. We have got a fast track on business registration and many other innovative services. And all this time, we were under attacks of Russian hackers all the time. So the more services we start, the more hacker attacks we have. We have been actually even paying to the hackers of the whole world, and we have built the whole world a very stable system that helps us to develop our products. And when the war started, we started to have thousands of from IT sector, from our technological companies asking us how to help. And when the Russian tanks entered Ukraine, we started the battle on the cyber front. So there is a certain coordination between the companies. We're giving them targets, we're discussing with them, we are trying to defend them, protect them in the cyberspace. There are some public targets that you can read on our sites, but this is a real army nowadays that formed, and they are coordinating their own efforts on the cyber front, and they are actually very much leading the cyber war. This is the first in the world cyber war, the first time in history that so openly the countries are attacking each other on the cyber front. And we have ruined the myth about the big Russian army of hackers, about courageous Russian hackers. We have seen that, in fact, Ukrainian IT specialists specialists, and the specialists in information security, they are more professional, they are more powerful, more capable, but they are standing for freedom, for democracy, for European values. That is why they did not manifest themselves before. They were investing more in the peaceful technologies in their own products, but when the time came, they're showing what they can do.
Sorry, do you think there are any limits to what that IT army can do? And I'm asking because one of the criticisms that it's gotten is that because it's sort of a beast of its own, it can actually engage in activities that can be considered very harmful, or at least not strategically contributing to where Western governments want to go, or how Europe sees the support to Ukraine, etc. So are there limits to what the IT army can do? For instance, is there a limit of what they can do in terms of offensive cyber attacks in Russia?
Well, in fact, there is a movement. The movement is very coordinated, and it's a very valuable movement, and it stands for freedom. I don't see any risks for democratic world. There is, of course, a huge risk for Russian Federation, and we will try to do our best to stop Russia and to show to the Russian public that their troops are killing our civilians, and we will fight on that front until our victory.
Let me turn to another aspect that's been a very important part of the strategy and the work you've been doing in the last months in this wartime situation, which is the digital blockade. Basically, from the start of the war, you've asked Western companies to pull out of Russia as an explicit strategy to try and hurt Russia in its economy and put pressure on the government and Russian government to change its thinking around invading Ukraine. So my question is, when does the digital blockade become a success? Have you found it a success so far? And where do you see this going next? What is the next stage of what a digital blockade could look like?
It will be successful if all digital and tech companies leave Russia and stop cooperating with Russia. Then we will consider it successful. That will throw Russia 20, 30 years back. So the future is for tech companies, is for tech governments. And that should be flexible and that should be efficient. And Russia is being left abandoned by many companies. Look at Gazprom, $100 billion. Now, before, but now it's much less. Tesla, 700, even 800 billions. One technological company, even a big company, is more than the whole Gazprom, which is the key company of the whole Russian Federation. And thus, many technological companies are booming in the world, in Paris, in London, in the United States, also in Ukraine, that their income is more than 1 billion. So the IT companies are creating more added value. They can capitalize very quickly. The future is after them. And who is creating these companies? Of course, creative people, engineers, who are used to have freedom. They like to have freedom for their creativity. They can create, and they want to live in comfort conditions and to have access to all possible technologies. And when, of course, when such technologies are restricted in Russia, these people leave the country, leave Russia. They cannot generate added value, and it stops capitalizing itself as a country. So the GDP level is decreasing, the country cannot finance the army, and then, in fact, the country is weakened. So the future is for the new technologies. If we want to stop the enemy, we will have to take away their future.
Is there a risk that tech companies pulling out will also mean that Russian opposition groups, and for instance, opposition manifesting in Russia itself, turning against its government and against its war in Ukraine, that part of the Russian society will actually have less access to free information, have less access, also abilities to communicate? Is that a risk that you are concerned about?
Well, I am not scared of that. As long as there is Wi-Fi internet in Russian Federation, their opposition and our information companies will manage to bring our truth to the citizens of Russian Federation. So as long as there is Wi-Fi, there are different possibilities to use access. They are using VPN, the social media. YouTube is blocked, but other social media through VPN are being open. So they are looking more like a rusty tank than booming IT companies. They are blocking their own social media, and people are resorting to VPN. You cannot stop technologies whenever there is access to Wi-Fi. We will continue to communicate the truth because we need to break through this cupola of propaganda which is covering Russia now.
You've executed on this strategy through tweets, essentially. You're very active on Twitter, on Telegram as well, towards the domestic audience. And what you've done is call out companies like Apple, like Google, and many others to actually pull out of Russia. And we've seen the success of that. Apple, Google, Siemens is another recent example where companies have actually responded to those calls. My question is, what do you find most successful, the public diplomacy that you're doing on Twitter or the bilateral conversations you have with, for instance, industry leaders about their involvement? Because the naming and shaming really does seem to work.
I think that this is a blended approach. We have to use both. We have to use all the instruments of diplomacy. And of course, we communicated with all these tech companies. For example, Apple, we wanted to use them for social polls. We met Stephen Cook and we asked them to help us to do the social poll of the Ukrainian population. I also met Vice President Google in Washington. We are cooperating with Google. There's other companies as well. So we continue our bilateral communication and public communication in terms of blocking the Russian Federation. But I'm sure that public communication works very efficiently because people are using real values when they're buying product, IT product. And when the country says that this company is subsidizing the army aggressor that kills civilians, then it means that that company is financing with its money these murders. So we need to address the business of the world. Either they continue financing the Russian army or they stop financing the Russian army. The sooner this decision is taken, the quicker the war will stop.
Let me take one question from the audience that we got in, which essentially links to a public diplomacy campaign you've managed, and you've managed to draw in Elon Musk, the American, the entrepreneur behind the Starlink project. So the question from an anonymous viewer is: how much support are you getting from Starlink in providing internet access in Ukraine? How will this evolve, and what other actors might contribute in providing internet access across Ukraine?
In fact, we have worked with SpaceX even before they started to help us during war. We wanted to open an office for SpaceX. We wanted to become one of the first countries that uses Starlink, even before the war. And so after war, this process has speeded up. And we've got more than 11,000 stations of Starlink, and they're very helpful. And partially through Elon Musk, partially through the digital ministers of the European member states. I'm very grateful, Minister of Digital Economy of Poland, Slovenia, and other countries of the European Union. And USAID, our American colleagues have also joined that movement. And Starlink is supporting the critical infrastructure and IT infrastructure of Ukraine. We're ready, even if there is no light, no fixed internet through generators. Using Starlink, we can renew any connection in Ukraine. A lot of medical hospitals are using Starlink. We are giving a lot of attention to the Sputnik Wi-Fi and another stable connection Wi-Fi. But it helps us. It helps us in our everyday fight on all the fronts, and this is very important. SpaceX also registered its company in Ukraine. Unfortunately, it happened during wartime, but they have done it. We wanted to do it in a peaceful time, but still it happened already. PayPal also started to work in Ukraine. Revolut started to work in Ukraine. Many companies just started, launched their activity during war, and I'm very grateful to each company because it's incredible support of our team and of Ukraine in general. It inspires us to fight because all IT companies are on our side and many citizens of the whole world support us.
I think what it also did, the support from Starlink, is in a very public way show that the West and people across the West are supporting Ukraine in this fight. What I'm curious about is because you're so active publicly and because this part of this conflict is also playing out in the digital space, I'm wondering if you consider Ukraine the winner of what is called the information war so far. Has Ukraine been more successful in fighting this war over the narrative of the conflict and the information that is spread across the world?
We have already won in the information war with Russia. As for today, Russia is only aiming for the domestic consumer in order to impose on them their fake narratives, but they cannot do that with the rest of the world. And in this direction, we are only talking about the truth. We are telling the truth. A lot of content which is spread all over the world shows what really happens in our country, and today the whole country, civilized democratic world, supports Ukraine, and Russia continues to target its message for the internal consumption, and we have a lot of good results, a lot of good experience in this fight, and believe me that the capacity, our capacity to reach citizens of Russian Federation in telling them the truth will only increase every day, and we only start in that direction. We did not involve ourselves so much before because we were directing all our efforts to build democratic Ukraine, to develop technologies in Ukraine. But until there are tanks of Russian Federation on the territory of Ukraine, we will increase our capacity to reach the citizens of Russia and tell them the truth.
Great. Well, thank you, Minister. Thank you for coming to our studio and joining us for the interview. And we wish you lots of luck in your further conversations with European counterparts. And with that, I'd like to bring it back to Aoife.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Mr. Fedorov, and thank you to the interpreters, DOQU. We still have one more name to unveil. This was a difficult decision for us in a year when there's been so much activity in the tech world. But we wanted to focus on who we think will be shaking the scene over the year ahead. Our number one pick as the most influential player in Europe this year is Ylva Johansson, European Commissioner for Home Affairs. Johansson is fast becoming Europe's most feared tech legislator. She may lack the star power that colleagues like Margrethe Vestager, Thierry Breton or Vera Jourova possess through the sheer size and weight of their various portfolios. But Johansson has managed to make a mark on Europe's approach to tech in a way that has industry executives on their toes. Her crusade against child sexual abuse material online has the whole tech industry worried. She's proposing a string of measures forcing social media and messaging platforms to get better control over the sharing of the harmful content or else face hefty fines. And she's not sparing her criticism of tech platforms for letting this slide in past years. Meanwhile, Johansson is strengthening Europe's police agency Europol with new powers, including storing data and cracking phones for evidence. Those efforts have privacy groups as well as the EU's own privacy watchdog on high alert. Johansson doesn't mince her words. She's a political bulldozer who's brushed aside criticism and pushed back abrasively. She wields a style of conversation that is more reflective of a trade union boss than it is of the traditionally reserved EU official. This makes the Swedish Social Democrat an effective operator inside the EU machinery for her sheer tenacity and combative nature. In the year to come, she'll shepherd her child sexual abuse material bill through negotiations. She'll butt heads with privacy activists and tech platforms. Those two lobbies are powerful players in Brussels, but they're quickly realising Johansson isn't one to back off. We hope our list has got you thinking about how the tech world is coping with the changes and challenges ahead of us. Our list of 28 power players is online on politico.eu for you to read and share. We want you to discuss our choices and decide yourselves how they should be ranked. You can also pick your own top 3 nominees and share those on social media using our Remix This List feature. Please tell us what you think of the list this year. We look forward to watching our power players in the year ahead, and we'll be keeping an eye out for how they fare and who else might be getting ready to steal the crown. Until next year, I'm Aoife White. This was Politico Europe's Tech 28 for 2022.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.